no. Para mí,
Come on, can we move it on? That's it, baby.
Pero estos dos que viven contigo.
I know you're on a roll.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know in the middle of this crisis and contingency that you give us some time to tell us how are things doing over there?
So we seem to have a much worse situation than Mexico, unfortunately. We've just passed a landmark, a very depressing landmark of 30,000 people dying from COVID, probably a lot more that we don't know about. So we're mournful. I think we know that we're through the surge and the peak of the epidemic, but things are still pretty busy in the hospital.
Now, we were just saying it's been a long way, and you've been in Africa, and you've been in emergencies like Ebola, SARS, and many others. What is different from COVID, Dr. Wright? What would you say is so different about COVID?
So the difference between SARS and MERS is, so while they were more fatal, so if you got them, you were more likely to die, they were less transmissible, so they were less infective and easier to control. And I think some of the lessons in particularly, South Korea and in Asia about how they control that stood them in good stead in dealing with COVID-19. For Ebola, they're both RNA viruses from bats, a lot of similarities actually, but Ebola spreads very specifically. It's most infective after death. So when it happened in West Africa, it would sort of creep through the sort of weaknesses in society and explode in small areas, such as in healthcare centers or at funerals where people were touching bodies after death when it's most infected. COVID-19, the difference is that it's a wave, it's swept over, like influenza, it's swept over society. It's been very difficult to get ahead of that curve.
Now, this diary, this journal you're keeping, is it a newfound habit or COVID motivated it, Dr. Wright?
So I did a series for the BBC when I worked in Ebola a few years ago. And when this came, I'm used to dealing with epidemics abroad. I never thought I'd have one in my own country. So it was a surprise. And like all epidemics, they come slowly and then they come very, very quickly. We were just we just weren't prepared for this one. But you could see it coming. Everybody could see the images of what was happening in Wuhan, and then in Italy and Spain, and pretty scary images. So when that was happening, we were busy preparing in the hospital. And the BBC, who I've been working with, asked me to do a diary, and that's been what I'm doing. I've been doing a diary for BBC Radio and World Service, just talking to my colleagues in the hospital, to patients who are suffering from COVID. Some have lived and some have died. And it's a very personal but intimate story about the tale of an epidemic as it sweeps across the country.
It's your day by day, right? And I personally think it's very, very enriching. It's a document. It's a scientific and historical document at the end.
Thank you. It's a bit of social history, actually. I think I'm surprised no one else has done this. And we see the media going into hospitals, into ICU, but actually the story is about how it's affected all of us. And this is a story about how it affects the hospital, from the cleaners through to the surgeons. So
all the personnel.
Everybody, yeah, and everybody's got their stories, and it's almost Shakespearean, actually. And it's like the tempest. It's like this thing coming, and how we react as a group, as a group of scared doctors and nurses and cleaners and healthcare staff, and then how we get used to it. and how we all, some of us fall sick and some of us don't, and some of our patients die and some of them don't. So.
Writing it and sharing it with the public, has it been cathartic for you?
Yeah, I was a bit ambivalent about doing it to start with, because doing it when you're abroad, it feels much more dispassionate. You've got a bit of distance from what you're doing as yourself. So I'm almost an observer when I go to Africa. Doing it home felt a little bit more, just a bit more intimate and a bit harder to deal with. So I was a bit unsure, but actually it has, you're right, it has been cathartic. It's been an honor to be able to capture the voices of my colleagues and my patients, and just, get the very emotional sense of what this means. So, during the course of the last few weeks, we've had, a patient who's got married just before.
Yeah. That went viral. That's why we looked for you. That went viral. Yeah. It was a very moving and touching story. Yeah.
It was. Yeah. And every time I think, it's, so the last one was this lovely couple. They've been married for almost 50 years and never separated in their whole lives. And, then he falls sick with COVID-19, comes into hospitals. First time they've been separated. A few hours later, she falls sick with COVID-19 and she comes in. And they end up in beds next to each other at the hospital. And that's very sweet as well.
I know. Now, doctors are supposed to not get emotionally involved. But I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, I don't think, I think it's a very, very emotional time for us. There's an element of fear and anxiety, particularly before the epidemic came, about what would happen. For me, it's something I've done for many times. So it's less, but, it's scary for me, but for most of my colleagues who've never done this, never dressed up in PPE, never had to be in a highly infected zone, it's pretty scary. So you've got that emotional sense. And then you do see a lot of people dying, and we've never seen that. We're a hospital, so we're used to people dying, but we've never seen it at the level that we've had before.
Yeah, and how is it dying from COVID? I just wrote a story, and I shared it with my audience about how many doctors and nurses are killing themselves. What do you see? What are you watching? What is it about COVID?
I think it's dangerous on the front line. I think we've got staff who are being exposed. It's such an infectious virus that even, I think our PPE hasn't been good enough to start with. I think we've underestimated what was required, and we've got better at that over time. And the whole world has, I think. This is when people have swabbed the surfaces of the wards, of the soap dispensers and things like that, you find the virus everywhere. So it's very difficult to get away from. And this happens with most epidemics. The health centers and hospitals, they become the plague centers. They become the places where staff and patients start infecting each other, and it amplifies, and it gets worse. And so staff, the first thing that happens is the staff fall sick. They are the canaries in the mine.
Because they're on the front line, and it's very disturbing, I guess. I don't know at what point your ethical oath lets you speak about this and share it with us. But it seems like very disturbing what you see and what you leave among all this crisis and contingency about COVID, specifically about COVID.
I think we've never had to get to the situation that they did in Italy, where they didn't have enough ventilators. So actually, while the UK hasn't done well in terms of the numbers of patients that died, actually the hospitals have coped very well. So we've never got to that capacity issue. But you notice the sacrifices that staff are making. I have the stories of my doctors and nurse colleagues who aren't seeing their children for weeks on end because they're worried about their children catching COVID-19. So they're working in the red zones, and they're separating their children, giving them to the parents to look after. And that's a tough thing. If you've got a 3 or 4 year old,
it could be very tough. Very tough. You you are a very renowned physician, and as we said, you've been in Africa, and you've been around. But is there anything about this disease that you haven't seen before?
Yeah, it's very interesting actually. I mean, Ebola was SARS and MERS. You know, they're have a high case fatality rate. Ebola in particular, you know, so over half of patients will die with Ebola. And Ebola is a nasty illness because it ends up with you.
Yeah.
You start bleeding from everywhere, and that's a really horrible way to die, actually. So COVID is very much around. We thought it was very much around the breathing and the lungs to start with. The more we learn, the more we realize that it's got these other effects as well, creating little clots, micro clots in our bodies that are, you know, affecting our pancreas and our limbs, our brains, and affecting this, triggering this immune reaction in the body. So it's very peculiar, actually, its effect. It's not just the virus. You know, we're used to catching viral illnesses. We all get them.
All the time.
All the time, yeah. And that sort of, you know, makes you think, well, you know, this is just another virus. But it has this trigger effect on our immune system that cascades this reaction of inflammation that seems to just overwhelm the body.
Tell me something, does the emotional state of the patient influence their progression? Because they're isolated all the time. They don't get to see their families. I mean, once you're there, you never get to talk to nobody, not even the doctors, because you're all dressed up. So does that have something to do with all this also? Do you think so?
Very good observation, actually. I think it must be really hard, actually. So, you know, in these red zones where we're looking after COVID-19 patients, if we let family in, particularly when there's ventilators with aerosol producing spread of the virus, we risk infecting the family. So in the early stages, we stopped visitors and we locked down the hospital, as elsewhere. More recently, we've tried to teach family, particularly at end of life, to you know, dress up in PPE and, you know, take a risk. And about half of them take that risk and do that.
They do take the risk.
Yeah.
And you admit that in the hospital. Okay.
We do.
That's great. Not in Mexico. I mean, once they leave, you never get to see them again.
Yeah, we had a big debate about this, and some of my colleagues felt very strongly, you know, we're protecting the family by keeping them away. Some of them said, look, you know, particularly at end of life, we're human beings. You know, let's be human about it and compassionate.
Yeah.
So I think we have moved to, if people are dying, we bring them in for that end of life stage. But you're right, that isolation in the hospital is a particular thing. And on the wards, you know, we're all walking around with these, you know, space suits on, and, you know, it's the scariest thing.
It's very scary, yeah.
It is. And if you've got, you know, we're getting quite a lot, you know, this is the people who are suffering most are the older, frail people. It's not, you know, while we're seeing people who are young who are dying, actually the biggest casualties are old, frail people. And many of them have a bit of dementia. And, you know, it must be the most frightening thing around to end up isolated in a hospital with all these people with space helmets on. So
yeah, very painful, very painful. Yeah, heartbreaking.
Yeah, and that emotional isolation, I think you're right. I think it does probably contribute to your physical recovery as well.
Now that you mentioned the elderly, I mean, we've been told that this illness affects the elderly. However, we've known that cardiovascular accidents, for example, and inflammation has affected younger patients. Is that okay? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think we're only really, you know, one of the interesting things, we're learning a lot from China, we're learning a lot from South Korea, we're learning a lot from Italy and Spain. As it spreads through the world, each country that gets it later is learning a little bit more from those who've been hit the hardest, soonest. And I think we're finding for the first time these unusual complications. So my ENT colleagues are saying that they're seeing a lot of, so classically people are saying you lose your sense of smell with COVID-19. And it is a very interesting feature. It's not like when you've got a blocked nose, when you've got a cold, you lose your sense of smell. But this is something very specific. It's not, you don't have a blocked nose, you actually lose your sense of smell. So it's a nerve damage thing. And we're starting to see patients with facial nerve palsies, with other sort of palsies as well. So it's affecting nerves, affecting our hearts. So we're seeing these patients who are recovered from the virus and then suddenly drop dead from, what seems to be heart damage. And I think over time we will see more of these long-term effects. So yeah, what an odd virus.
It's still very little what you know about COVID. I mean, the scientific community is still very little what you know about COVID.
Every day I wake up and I learn more. It's not, I did, medicine, other diseases, you learn them and you deal with them, and that's it. You just get used to them. This one, it's just a rapid learning.
Now, tell me one more thing. How do you think Great Britain entered to this thing on time? Because I think you were betting, Britain was betting on collective immunity, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, my question would be, was it too late or was it just on time?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think time will tell. I think we were a little bit Brazil at the start. And I think everybody a lot of people, myself included, felt that we should have acted earlier. We could see what was happening in other countries and we needed to be sooner. And the national comparisons are really interesting. So Ireland, which is, very similar, next to us, they locked down about 10 days before us and have had a very mild impact of what's happened. So there'll be lots of lessons to be learned from this. So I think we could have locked down sooner. I think we could have had better testing as well. Testing seems to be one of the key things that we've lost out.
Now, about the testings, you're doing a lot of tests. It's tests and tests and tests.
Yeah.
Not in Mexico. That's why I asked you. In Mexico, they're not doing enough, very few tests.
Yeah.
So
why are they
I don't know how certain the diagnosis is. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, here it was a capacity issue. We just didn't have the testing capacity. Whereas in Germany, for example, in South Korea, they had great testing and they were able to quickly identify. Epidemiology and epidemics is quite straightforward. You find the case, you isolate them, and then you look at the contacts and you see if anybody test them, and if they've got it, you isolate them. And here, it sounds as though Mexico was a little bit like the United Kingdom. We just sort of let it happen. And I think one of the lessons is we needed to be quicker and acting started. And the key to that, you can isolate anybody, but you've got to be able to test them first. So
yeah,
really fundamental.
Now, what about the herd immunity?
Yeah,
that's what we have left.
Yeah, there are people arguing both sides of this. That I think one of the things, I don't think people had heard of herd immunity before this debate. So, and it's not a good term. It makes us cattle. So I think it's a derogatory term.
Yeah, it makes you think about cattle. You're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, we're still humans.
Yeah, we're humans and we lose that. So, this is going to go through our communities. And there's a little bit of, we need to make sure that health services don't get overwhelmed. We need to have good treatments. And actually the drug trials are really moving ahead. You asked about the science of this. Every scientist in the world is working on this. So it is amazing how everybody's come together. And I think we will have effective treatments soon, actually. The vaccine is a long way off, but the treatments will.
How long? How long? Like 2 years, maybe, or next year?
I think people are talking about the end of this year, and I think that's hugely optimistic.
You don't see it, yeah.
I don't see it. So I think 18 months, and I'd also be cautious about whether we can develop vaccines. So like classically HIV, we haven't got a vaccine, or malaria. So. It's not as easy as some of these vaccines, that small.
And the treatment, the cure, you think it would happen this year?
I think we'll have very soon, in the next few weeks and months, we'll have evidence from trials showing which drugs work. And I think a lot of drugs aren't doing very well, but I think there'll probably be a combination of drugs that works. I think like HIV, it won't just be one drug. we'll have a cocktail of something that knocks out the virus and something that helps the inflammatory system and something that, protects the lungs. So it may be a combination of things that works in the end.
And what about the protocols? Are you using any protocols in the hospital that are proven good success?
Yeah, I think the key success for us is non-invasive ventilation. So these CPAP machines, continuous positive airway pressure. These are anybody who's got sleep apnea. So any of your listeners who a bit overweight, get a bit of snoring, have these simple bedside sleep apnea machines. They just push a bit of air in and keep the airway going. And you can get big machines like this, just a little bit bigger actually, that seem to just inflate the lungs. And they seem to have been remarkably effective. One of the mistakes, I think, from Italy was that people ended up, and in London, I think, was people ended up on ventilators too quickly. And when you're on a ventilator, you're weeks. This isn't like a normal infection. You're there for 3 or 4 weeks. And I think the ICUs, the intensive care units, just got a bit full. So managing upstream, keeping these positive air, just a mask with a positive airway pressure, keeping the lungs full of oxygen seems to be really effective.
When do you decide to use a ventilator?
When do you decide? So you have to, I think you have to be cautious, because if you ventilate people who are never going to come round, and this is a tough ethical decision, you go back to the ethics here, it's unfair. You're not going to, you're just delaying death. So some of the key decisions are when patients are coming in, having very open discussions with them and their families about what their chances of survival are. And if this is someone who's not going to do well on ICU, intensive care, one of the key things to remember is that, 2/3, maybe 70%, sometimes more than that, of people who end up on intensive care will die. So this is not a place to go to. I think everybody thinks intensive care, that's the best place to be. But actually, it's probably the hardest place to be. So if we can manage people before then, it's better.
Now, it's also been controversy, at least in Mexico, in my country, about the use or no of masks. What are your thoughts on that? I mean,
yeah,
can it be worse?
There's a little bit of evidence that they may help. I sort of feel a bit sad, actually. I think there's something in the face and the smile that we're talking to each other. There's something in the face and the smile that is so important to our communication. And I find it a bit depressing that we have a future where we're all walking around with masks on. And I'm sure there may be a very small benefit, but even
now and during the crisis, what are your thoughts? I mean, shall we use them?
So I think the evidence is probably, so if you've got COVID, it stops it being spread. So it doesn't protect. There's a slightly tricky thing. And that makes it harder. So people will say you're selfish if you're not wearing it. I think there's something about keeping social distance and not having to wear them would be my preference.
That's the best thing, right? Yeah, that's the best. Yeah, that's the best thing. Which has been the most brutal or touching story yet in the hospital, John?
I think there's so many stories, actually. I think, I've seen my nursing colleagues who become very, very sick, almost dying, who then have recovered. And that, people who put their lives on the line looking after patients, then becoming sick, that's quite a tough one. The couple who got married just before he died, that was a very, what a lovely story, and that very emotional story. The couple who'd been married for 50 years, it couldn't be sweeter, actually. I mean, she's come back into hospital, unfortunately, but she's doing okay.
So she's doing good.
She's okay, yeah.
She's doing,
great. Yeah. And then, we've just, one of the ones coming up on the program next week is this 50-year-old guy who really, really came close to death, 4 weeks on a ventilator. And he's got his zest, his joie de vivre back again. And it's great listening to somebody who can't remember anything about being ventilated, woke up and suddenly he's in an intensive care unit, and he thinks he's getting paranoid. He just talks about being paranoid, thinking that everybody was trying to kill him. And you can imagine that, to suddenly wake up in an intensive care unit.
Of course, yeah. Do you think things will change for doctors after COVID?
Yeah, I think this is part of the problem, is that we think it's going to come and go, and it's not. It's going to stay with us, and we have to adapt our hospitals to be, it's going to be with us for a long time. So we're planning, how do we, what happens? Do we have hospital lifts anymore? Can people go up in lifts? Or how do you have a one-way system around the hospitals to stop people talking to each other? Can you keep a green zone and a red zone? Patients coming into the green zone, inevitably some of them have COVID-19, and so they then infect other people. So it's a conundrum.
Now, you've been in countries with a very poor health system, and that makes a difference. And it's again, it's very painful.
Yeah. I think Africa has, in particular,
that's the difference between life and death.
Yeah, and countries where death is a much more common experience, and I think in Mexico and in Europe we're not so used to it. It's not an everyday occurrence, whereas in African countries it still is. Children dying and parents dying. So I think there's a much more but I'm not sure if that particularly helps, actually. But the health systems in a lot of African countries are pretty poor, and that's why they're particularly risky in terms of the spread of the disease. But so far, they seem to have done okay, actually. I mean, South Africa seems to have been remarkably effective.
To be doing okay. Have you ever been scared of getting sick, John?
Yeah, I was scared. When I came back from Sierra Leone, a day after I came back, a couple of days after, I started getting a fever. And one of my colleagues who came back with me got Ebola, and she was very, very sick. And I was scared then. This time, I think, the mortality from COVID-19 is around 1%. And, for my age group, it's much less than that. If you're over 85, it's much higher, it's 15%. For me, it's less. So it's not, I don't know if I was so scared about it, but I was nervous about it. And particularly when you see the people around you just falling sick, your medical and nursing colleagues, you just think, well, is it going to be me next?
Yeah, it's very scary, very scary. What does we were talking about, I don't want to be intrusive in your personal life, but we were talking about your wife, that that she speaks Spanish. What's her profession? Is she also?
So she's a doctor as well. She's a neurologist. She has gone back. I mean, one of the things is that our specialist doctors have gone back to being junior doctors. So she's done that. She's a very highly specialist multiple sclerosis doctor. And she's gone back to being a junior doctor and just looking after COVID patients in the ward. So,
and you have children.
And we have children, yeah. So they're all grown up. But one of them has come back to live with us during this, and the other two seem to be doing okay. So
yeah, because we were talking about family, and you're always scared about, like risky with your family. It's very risky.
Yeah. I think I probably the same. In Italy and in Spain, in Mexico to some extent. In the city where I work, which is very multi-ethnic, we have a lot of multi-generational houses. So parents living with children, living with grandparents. And that's a particularly risky thing. So for us, with our children who are in their 20s, that's fine.
That's not your case, yeah.
But for grandparents, that's a risky thing. So that's the worry.
John, keep safe. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Now, is there any way we can watch what you're doing and the journals? Is there any way we can have access to that and share it with this part of the world?
It's on the BBC World Service. I can see. Shall I see if I can send you some links to that? Would that help? Would you be able to?
Oh yeah, great. That would be great. Okay. So we can share it with the audience. That would be great.
It would be. I'd love to be able to. doing. So
Well,
I will.
thank you so much,
It's a
John.
pleasure.
Thank you so much. Keep safe. Thank you very much. Take
Okay.
care. Bye.
You-
Bye.
Bye.